it struck me as interesting, Karin, in your talk, this idea about these beads being considered as trinkets, these beads being considered as not worthy of something, not having value, but you assert these histories of how the beads were used as currency and really sort of a powerful value in the everyday lives of African people, but that there were these imposing ideas about, oh, you don't know what that is, you don't know what this is, this doesn't mean anything. But then there was this also these ideas around how these beads became these sort of symbols of power. These beads became, I thought it was interesting how you spoke about that tension between ornament and currency, and how these beads really became, really determined wealth and status and influence. So these tensions, these tensions around market and who gets to establish market, who gets to determine market value. Denise, I really appreciated your talk and your exploration of just value as a concept, as an idea, as a even sort of the void, right? This sort of void that you kept sort of pushing into. This idea of value not being simple and belonging to a thing or an event, being so complex, but then also being nothing at the same time. These sort of philosophical questions, who gets to ask even questions about value, who gets to make determinations of value, who gets to feel valued, who imposes a value, who extracts value. So all of these really important questions. And Alexandra, this idea of sort of human and spirit, and I love that story, sort of this sort of going and coming, this idea of what is valued maybe in the home, in a relationship, in what's valued out in the world. This idea of reclamation and naming, this sort of new uses for materials within an indigenous cultural context, different from maybe what's out in the world, and how sort of even crossing, there was this crossing over. There's this out in the world, but then there's this, here's who we are here, and here's sort of our relationship to things unknown that maybe sort of people that are trading in a larger market, in a different economy, are not considering. I love this idea of sort of human and spirit and human, and all of that sort of being one. I love that you talked about the color blue, and that you said that you want to talk about the cosmological significance of that, so we can absolutely sort of enter into that. And I love this idea of little spirit berries being this life-giving sort of presence, even, right? I can't even just say it's just an object. It's almost like a presence. It has a kind of life, and it being about peace and blessings and a good mind. So thank you all. So I do wonder if we might just settle into, just from each of your talks, this idea about what do we mean by maybe economy or economic structure. What do we understand about that in terms of how you all are sort of entering into this? What is an economy? What is an economic structure? what are maybe some words that come to mind, or your understandings of this idea of economy, of economic structure, sort of through the lens of your talks?
I was thinking about that because the word economy, I was terrible in economics class in high school. So, but I really, I thought about what that word means. And I love words and etymology. And the word economy has to do with the home, like management of the home, materials. And so I was thinking about like indigenous economy, like what does that look like? And our home was where we were from. It was the land. It was, and we understood, that your kin, you exist because you're in relation. And I know Tanya Lucan Linklater's in the room, and her work is just so inspiring about how are you in relation with other people, other beings, like more than what we call, I guess, in English, it would, I guess, be called more than human beings. So like this like spirit realm. And we only dwell here. We don't control anything. And so much of our economy, I guess, is based on these ideas of reciprocity, accountability. So I think like that story with the beaver, it's kind of like indigenous economy, because the beaver gives up his body, but he always comes home. And he comes home because the Anishinaabe leave offerings and they bring the bones back to the water. And so it's about that reciprocity and that understanding of like the beaver's giving his body and it's important to give back. So it is this inherently reciprocal relationship that we only exist in relation to beavers. And so I think a lot of our like economics, if we can call it that way, in a customary way, would have to do with, at the center of it is this idea of reciprocity in our exchange, and your accountability. So if you exchange with somebody, you're now accountable to them. And what does that mean? And it's, you have to constantly renew that relationship too. So the humans always have to, give gifts to the beaver. So it's like this, it's a constant reminder that if you enter into a relationship, you're accountable to that person for as long as you want to have a healthy relationship with them. Yeah,
I appreciate that economy, language being insufficient to be able to describe systems. And that makes me think of you, Denise, because my sense is economy might be something that you could begin to question within the realm of your talk and your thinking, and that possibly economy is something that we think exists but really doesn't, or we've placed some kind of value or some kind of idea on economy. I'm wondering what you're thinking about in terms of that.
Yes, I think what's the best way of saying that? Well, the best way of talking about it is that one of my obsessions for many years has been the limitation of historical materialism or Marxism, how it has been unable to account for colonial subjugation and racial subjugation. And that has to do precisely with the idea, which is not an idea, which is constitutive of modern knowledge, that will have all those separate realms of study, of investigation, and political economy was one that was set by itself. But when we attend to colonial and racial subjugation, but also to cis-heteropatriarchal subjugation, we find precisely that. We find that the echo is about the household, right? It's about the whole of the social context. And in that context, you can't separate the economic and the ethical. So one of the things that are crucial in any racial, that has been crucial to any racial theory or to any racial argument about inferiority, for instance, has been the devaluation of the ways of thinking, precisely of those from whom the extraction of land and labor has been crucial for capital. So in that sense, that's why I kept repeating this liberal political structures or this political architecture in the philosophical sense, precisely to think about the whole of the house of the context and not only about exchange or production or whatever.
Pulling us out of dichotomy, pulling us out of, Yeah, Karin, any thoughts?
Yes. Well, when I think about the economy and the economic structure in relation to my research, what comes to my mind are relationships, of course, as Alexandra said, but also connections. In what we can define asymmetrical power relations. That, however, in the 19th century, when we think about the trade in glass beads, we can see what can be defined the power of African consumers, because their way of rejecting the glass beads they did not want, and their ability to select the beads that they wanted in many ways, that was very much connected to the local economies and local trade exchanges, had a very important impact on Venice and the production of glass beads in Venice, and on the employment of labor there, and the thriving of the local economy in Venice. So this produced in many ways, this forced European traders, European producers to negotiate and adapt to the African demand. And it is not only for glass beads, but also for cloth, for other imports in the 19th century. And this was also valid for the colonizers in the early colonial period. Then, of course, we know that at the end, Africa were almost fully colonized. So we know the end of the story. But if we look at what's happening in the 19th century when African economies were involved into the global economy, then we have another perspective of the role that African traders, consumers had in the economic structure.
So you all have spoke to relationship, all of you, in your various talks, in the research that you're doing. Might we discuss this ideas of relationship, ideas of reciprocity, and these historical ideas and acts of the global trade? Maybe we could sort of talk a little bit about trade and relationship and reciprocity, how beads might sort of be at play in that, but maybe even sort of larger, this idea of you all are talking about relationship, you all have mentioned reciprocity. Maybe you could sort of speak to that a little bit.
I think in terms of relationship, beads, and what I saw in that story, and I've heard that story many, many times, and I've read it, but it wasn't until thinking through this talk and Kapwani's project that I paid attention to what she was wearing when she came, when she sort of crossed, I guess, or what she was bringing with her from that realm. So it was obviously valued by them too, and I think that's how we thought about beads, was that, maybe like we valued them because they pleased the spirits, because they brought about blessings from that other world. And so in being in relation with them, with, this animated or animate land, water and skyscape, to be in good relation, if we, in the Anishinaabe cosmos, we kind of viewed the world as being like this layered cosmos. So you have the sky world, the earthly realm where we live, and then the water. And we just kind of dwell in the middle here. And in order to kind of maintain a good life, a healthy life, we had to maintain balance between these two kind of opposing realms. And so I think you wanted to please the spirit so that you could maintain this kind of holistic, healthy cosmos around you for you and your family and your loved ones, and for everyone else who lives here. So
and it wasn't individual, it was collective.
Yeah. And I think when we created wampum belts between indigenous nations, that really meant something. And then when we did that with newcomers who came in, that we felt that meant something. But now, it's clear that a lot of the treaties haven't been followed. And I mentioned it a bit before about the importance of renewing relationship. So one of those wampum belts was called the Covenant Chain, and there's a series of agreements between the indigenous people and European newcomers, and they were called Covenant Chain alliances. And it really came from this metaphor of a chain made of like shiny metal that you needed to polish. And so every time people got together to renew treaty agreements, it wasn't so much like you come here, we make treaty, and like that's it. We both agree. It was about you needed to polish that chain, and so you need to constantly kind of be cultivating that relationship so that it doesn't get rusty and like fall apart. So I think that's how we think a lot about relationship in terms of and how that was encoded in beads. And when knowledge keepers talk about wampum, they talk about them as being materials that like they hold like the deep knowledge, they hold memory. Encoded in them are, they're a witness to these relationships that were forged at those moments of encounter.
We follow in the order. I'm still thinking. I think in this context of value, and the one we're talking about, liberal, modern liberal one, reciprocity is impossible in a way, unless there is an assumption of full identification, full identity. So among the same, then you can imagine like reciprocal relations, connections. But in that case, then everyone has the same value. I'm still thinking about the value, right? But given that this particular social structure in which we live, it is marked by difference. And value, one of the ways of defining value is saying it is difference, even though it's not only. Then hence, obviously, the notion of justice itself that we have is one of bringing all together, so as you will not have these differentials, whether you have a hierarchy and opposition, or you think in terms of gradation. So there is a way in which the idea of justice, the realization of justice would be the disappearance of value, when everything would have the same value. But then we also assume that it would be the same. And given that this whole thing only functions through difference, that's never going to happen.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this and about value and, the big question that Denise made, what is value and how value is attributed, and also how value changes within this system of exchange. So really the connection between value and exchange and how they influence each other. It's a difficult question to answer through the historical sources I have been working on over the years. You see that glass beads entered East Africa through trade as currency, so they were economic objects. But once they left the economic circuits, the value exploded. The meanings of value they had exploded because they were used in rituals. They were used to make ornaments. They were used in shrines. It's expanding, and I think that one also how this connection between value and exchange changes over historical periods. Again, with colonization, what happened to these beads? We don't know. They had been accumulated because they were wealth, they were money. And so chiefs, traders had these beads that suddenly became of almost no value. And we know very little as historians of what happened to these beads and how this had an impact on social hierarchies, political hierarchies in colonized East Africa. And so how value was one thing, and then with the changing historical conditions, value and reciprocity as well were totally other things. Yeah, so it's more questions than answers.
More questions, and I want to leave a few questions for us, but I also want to, just because I promised Alexandra color, I just want to take a moment and sort of deal with color, just because I think we can't not deal with color, but then I want to leave everyone with a few questions, and we may have time for one question in the audience, maybe one. But Alexandra, we've talked a bit about color, and Karin, you also spoke about color and this idea of color. Alexandra, might you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, so I think there might be more questions than answers. I don't think we ever really know for sure. But there was preferences. Like you can see that in, the trade, the HPC account books and ledgers. And women were active in the trade, and, beads and stitching and the sewing of garments was considered women's knowledge. And so you do see a preference for certain colored fabrics, certainly, and beads. And so thinking about the color blue, and when we met with Kapwani and that question came up, I immediately thought of when I was working at the National Gallery, we did a rehang in the Indigenous and Canadian galleries, and several advisors were convened to talk about, how do we do this task of representing Indigenous nations from time immemorial all across, Turtle Island. And the advisors had said that in the first room, which would hold some of the oldest ancestor objects, some of them were 5,000 years old. How do we honor these belongings, which we do have inherent power? They are alive in some cases. So how do we honor these belongings, these ancestors? And one suggestion that had come up that everyone agreed with was that they should be lifted up in with blue plinths. And they should kind of be held in this color blue, because so many of us, it seems, across Canada anyway, across our nations, a lot of our creation stories, like where we either come from the sky or we come from the water, like a great flood. And so it really was this cosmological reference to this is our beginnings, some of these the oldest ancestor objects that we have, those are our creation stories, and they come from the sky and the water. So that's kind of what I imagine it had to do with.
I don't know, Karin, if you want to just say something briefly about color. We're at time, but I just wanted to deal with color.
Yeah, I would like to have an answer and to say, yes, blue was the favorite color, but I don't think there was a favorite color in East Africa. When Barton, who was the first to travel into the interior regions, listed the kind of beads that were in demand, he mentioned 400 varieties. And he spoke about different regions that had different types of beads, blue, black, red, white, yellow beads. No one has yet attempted, but I'm working on this with some colleagues to understand how these currency areas developed. I'm not even sure if there was a cultural meaning related to the color. I would be tempted, but probably because of my background, to explain this as with economic reasons and trading connections. But yeah, it's very a lot of variety of colors, and how Europeans perceived these changes, I think, was really connected to traders coming from different regions where different colors were in use.
I think the best way to sometimes leave programs is with questions. So I want to leave you with a few questions. I think we're maybe out of time to be able, can we take one question from the audience? Okay. So I'm going to, how about we take a question from the audience and then I'll leave you with a few questions that speak directly to the work. Does anyone have a question? It's okay if you don't. I know it's the first session. You might just need to get warmed up. Oh, Kapwani, you look like you have a question. We'll take your question.
I've been thinking about this for a bit longer than most, maybe. So it was interesting, again, this question of relationships. And Denise, I think you mentioned contractual philosophy, and then Alexandra spoke about reciprocity. And in the kind of, the formula that you had laid out as far as like negative and zero and all the rest, I had a couple of kind of questions about where's the extraction of the value of life, of energy in these equations, right? And it goes somewhere, and it goes in, and it doesn't just disappear, but it's negated in this particular formula. So when we talk about the political or the architecture, it's not a question. I'm just talking. Sorry, but I'm getting there. So I wonder, like in that kind of formula, where does that value go? Because it doesn't disappear. Right, and it goes. Sometimes it goes underground because it resists. It's resilient somehow, but it's not in this equation. But we know that it doesn't. Energy doesn't just disappear. It's circulated. It navigates in different ways. So I wondered about that, and from both of your, in the food that's ingested, I guess, with the trading of beads, right? So it disappears, but it also is regenerated in different ways.
Yes. So okay, I have another image. English as one way of responding to your question. You can imagine two sides connected by the equal sign. Okay, so on the one hand, you have the excess that has been extracted and expropriated, that now is accumulating up there, destroying life on the planet, which is here, right? It's in this building also too, and that is defined by the form of value, the form of life. And then you have infinity minus infinity, which is everything else that is not defined by the form of life. Yes. So that's what blackness does. It points to the extraction, the excess, and the violence, and at the same time explodes it to open up to everything else that is undeterminable, unthinkable under those conditions. The nickel sign it doesn't work, but it's the best of the equations.
So I'd like to leave us with a few questions for us to sort of wrap our minds and hearts around, and as we continue to engage with Kapwani's work. How does Kapwani Kiwanga's Trinket as a work of art, as a presence of materials and concept, exercise these ideas we've been discussing this morning? How do we see these ideas? Where do we see these ideas being explored and asserted in the work? So I'd love for us to continue to think about that as we go about our day. I want to thank Karin, Denise, Alexandra. What a pleasure to be with you. I want to thank all of you. Thank you so much. Take care.